everybody. Welcome to Probiotics. I'm April DePriest. I'm an exercise physiologist and I'm working on a doctorate in applied physiology. So what I study is how the things you eat get across your gut lining and what they do when they're in your body. Probiotics is a topic that's one of my favorites. I'm kind of an armchair probiotics aficionado. So we'll go over some of this stuff today. I actually do a lot of interviewing. Here we go. Interviews with some really prominent, nationally renowned gastroenterologists to sort of put this together. And I wrote a couple of articles that were published. You can Google them if you want. But we're going to talk about all that stuff, the most important stuff from what I learned today. So, an intro to probiotics. In the 19th century, there was a scientist working so this is the 1800s in Russia. And if you know Russian history, you know that they sort of freed their slaves or their serfs around the late 1800s. And scientists were sort of watching these very poor people. And it was kind of weird to them because up until then there had been these wealthy landowners that were not nearly as robust in health as these really, really poor farmers. And one of the things they noticed were that they were drinking like a yogurt type drink. And so this doctor back then decided that maybe there was something in that drink that was helping them to be so healthy, that they could fight off colds much better and things like that. So he noticed the connection between their lactobacillus-rich milk and how healthy they were. Later on in the 20th century, they categorized these organisms, and he called them probiotics. So in Greek, pro meaning for, biota meaning life, probiotics. It just means, for your life. In 1935 was the first time that a drink like this became commercially available. And it's called Yakult, and it's something like kefir or something like that. Much later, in 2006, an explosion of these products containing probiotics became marketed, from pills to drinks to things like kombucha, all about, alleged health-related benefits, and we're going to talk about some of those health-related benefits today. So what is a probiotic? The definition is live microorganisms which, when administered in adequate amounts, meaning that you get enough of it, that they give you a health benefit. So, in a more simple definition is that they're just healthy bacteria that naturally reside in your gut, and they promote immunity and digestion and things like that, as opposed to bad bacteria, which do what? So these are some of the questions that I asked some of these really renowned gastroenterologists who study this stuff. And I kind of sometimes wish I was studying this stuff, except for in order to study probiotics, you kind of have to look at people's poo. So I'm happy to be an armchair microbiotic person. So how do they function? The human intestinal tract has been compared to an ecosystem, which just means that there's hundreds of thousands of different kinds of microorganisms living there. Most of them are anaerobic, meaning that they don't use oxygen, meaning that they ferment their food, just like, grape juice gets fermented and it turns into wine. So they ferment things, which sometimes makes you have gas. So we'll talk about that too. These microorganisms, called the gut's microbiota, they populate your gut right after birth. And they necessarily through food and environmental exposure. So they just kind of populate that area, and you're going to learn a little bit more about that in a second. Our intestinal bacteria weigh up to 2.2 pounds in there. That's a lot, considering that they're so small that you have to look at them in a microscope. They outnumber our own body cells by 10 to 1, meaning that for every one cell you have that's your own body cell, there are 10 bacterial cells in your gut that are in there helping you. That's pretty cool. So they help us out by producing nutritional factors like vitamins and short-chain fatty acids. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Vitamin K, folate, so those are things that you need, especially folate. If you're a pregnant woman, you need that. As we get older, we need that. We'll talk about what short-chain fatty acids do in a little bit. But they do this by eating, or mostly fermenting, fibers that we aren't always able to break down on our own. So for instance, if you have a black bean burrito, there are a lot of things called oligosaccharides, or long chains of carbons, or what do we call them? Carbohydrates, that our bodies don't necessarily have enough enzymes to break down on their own. So these guys go in there and they break them down, and when they do that, they create these other factors. So things like B vitamins and short-chain fatty acids are the byproduct of this, of them eating that stuff. So how do they function? Gastrointestinal bacteria are critical for the normal development of our immune system. They stimulate the growth of our intestinal lining and prevent proliferation of disease-causing bacteria within the intestine. So what does that mean? That means that if you get something like a bacteria that might give you diarrhea, these guys actually prevent that guy from being able to populate your intestine and make you sick. They do a lot of other things, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail with some graphics to kind of show you how that happens. So from there, scientists have been able to trace benefits that go to your brain and your lungs, and I'm sure there's more and more to come as we continue to study this stuff. So this is a figure that's actually from an immune modulation study. So this is like something a real scientist put in his paper when he was trying to explain how that they know that these lactobacilli help us. So LCG, that just stands for lactobacilli group. Lactobacilli are like the same things that you see in your yogurt. Like if you get that little green yogurt that we know that helps us with our gut bacteria, or actually any yogurt will have lactobacilli in it. It's the same thing that they found in those Bulgarian farmers in Russia. So these are those. And we see that they have enhanced brain function through whatever they're doing in your intestines, then can travel through your vagus nerve to your brain. And we find that there are all kinds of benefits from mood to memory. Anti-cancer activity. So if you take a look at this slide, this is just your intestinal wall. These are your intestinal cells here. And on one side, you'll have the inside of your intestine, and on the other side is your blood, is your bloodstream. So, and it's how things get through and into your blood. So you have a tumor here, and we'll see that sometimes these lactobacilli actually help to reduce the size of tumors. That's another paper. I don't have a lot about that today, but if you're ever interested, you can always email me and we'll chat about it. Immune modulation. So here again, so these are intestinal cells here, and in between each cell sometimes is a way for something to get into your body. So here's the inside of your intestine, here's your blood, how you get into your body. Just for a note, nothing that hangs out in your intestine that you eat gets into your body unless it makes it through here into your blood. So sometimes it can go through a cell and the cell will let it in, and sometimes they can sneak through. If you ever heard of like leaky gut, that's kind of what that means. They sneak through these gap junctions here. And so on the inside of your intestine, what these good bacteria can do is kind of stimulate your own immune system. Another thing they can do is to sort of create their own immunity so that they go after bad bacteria in your intestines and kill them themselves. So your immune system doesn't even have to do anything. They're killing them already for you because they don't want those bad bacteria taking up their space and eating up their good food. A lot of bad bacteria do a lot of other things, and for instance, when it gives you diarrhea, it actually will kill the bad guys off. Or the good guys off, I'm sorry. So they don't want that. They're always trying to get rid of those bad guys. So these bacteriocins, that's called competitive exclusion, meaning that they're competing for that healthy space in your intestines, and they want those bad guys out of there, so they kill them themselves. Another thing that they do is increase the barrier function. Remember over here we talked about leaky gut? Same thing. They sort of decrease the distance from these cells together, so they make those tight junctions even tighter so you can't get things across your gut lining. And so before I talked about some nutritional factors that these bacteria help to create, we're going to go over some of that through here. So how do these guys get into your body? You eat them through your dietary intake. So you can take them as a supplement. I'll talk about that in a little bit. You can take them in through, your foods, your drinks, kimchi. If you don't like, yogurt, there's always nut versions of yogurt and kombucha and things like that. It goes into your intestines, so you eat it, makes it through your stomach acids, whatever survives then gets into your intestine where they begin to populate. They become gut microbiota. They are assimilated by your gut microbiome. So that means that they're allowed in, they're part of the neighborhood, they start eating what you ate and breaking it down for you. And then they make their own bacterial metabolic enzymes. When they're doing that and they're breaking down your food, some of the byproducts are things like short-chain fatty acids. Other things are things like vitamins, like vitamin K we talked about, and folate, a lot of B vitamins will come from that. Short-chain fatty acids stimulate our own immune system, which then will move throughout your body and help fight off bad guys in other places. So those short-chain fatty acids will go back to your gut and kill off bad guys. They'll go into your lungs, and they can actually help reduce the duration of a respiratory infection, and crosses the blood-brain barrier where it can do a lot of interesting things, and we'll talk about that later. So let's take a look at the lung bacteria versus intestinal bacteria and how these guys help kill off infections in your lungs. So we'll start down here. Again, we have our intestinal cells. We have the inside of your intestine. So this is the food that you ate and where it travels. And this is your bloodstream, okay? So here we have gut bacteria. And just by being gut bacteria, it can stimulate your immune cells because they see them as foreigners. And they're like, oh, we better proliferate and have more immune cells. Sometimes they can get eaten by your immune cells, and then they'll wind up heading off to your lymphatic system. So that's like, if your glands get enlarged sometimes because maybe you have a reaction to something, maybe you're allergic to something, or maybe you have an infection. That's your lymph node, and that kind of helps to clear bad guys out of your bloodstream, and you'll eliminate them through other processes. So the other thing that they do is these gut microbiota, they eat your food, and they create things like short-chain fatty acids, which then can cross through very easily because our body needs them, cross through your gut lining into your bloodstream. And these short-chain fatty acids now are part of your blood, and they stimulate our own immune cells. When they get to your lung barrier, they sort of have increased your immune cells, which can then go after bad lung bacteria, which then our immune system eats those bad bacteria. That's what phagocytosis right here means. And then that goes back into your lymph system, and this whole thing starts again. So we have this really positive feedback loop of good gut bacteria being able to help us fight off other kinds of infections. That's basically what this picture shows us. For a long time, people suspected that taking probiotics was helpful in terms of fighting off things like colds. And this particular study looked at a bunch of other studies, and, as well as one big study that they did, where they were able to actually see that by taking probiotics, they reduced the duration of lung infections. Isn't that cool? That is super cool. So what's a fatty acid? What's a short-chain fatty acid? I keep talking about a short-chain fatty acid. The nice thing about these videos is if you hate chemistry and you don't want to care about any of this stuff, you can just fast forward through the next minute or so. But a short-chain fatty acid kind of looks like this. Here and here, you're going to see a carbon. So there's 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 4 carbons. And that's all it is. And here this double bond is, you'll have something like an oxygen. Here we have a medium chain fatty acid. So you see like more carbons, more carbons, more carbons. Okay, and then you might have heard of something called a medium chain triglyceride, which MCTs. A lot of times if people are on keto, they'll take MCT oil. It's the same thing as coconut oil. And all that means is that you've taken 3 medium chain fatty acids and you tied them together with carbon. So that's what a medium chain triglyceride is. And we know that these are helpful in terms of an energy source. And then here's something that looks like a long chain fatty acid. So remember, a medium chain fatty acid is like 2, 3, or 4 carbons. These have a whole bunch of carbons. And that's all the difference means. So that they're a lot more difficult, takes a lot more work to metabolize these guys. Short chain fatty acids get metabolized really fast, and they're used up for energy in many different ways. So here are some of the things that they do. They decrease intestinal permeability. That means they shorten up those tight junctions and make it harder for things like leaky gut, make it harder for things that you don't want getting across your gut lining to get across. They decrease the pH of your gut, which makes it harder for bad bacteria to live there. So one of the things that I don't love about a diet like a keto diet is that it actually increases the pH of your gut, and it makes it harder for good bacteria to live there. So short chain fatty acids are really great because they come from eating things like foods that bacteria like, and then they help us in many, many ways. Also making it easier for these bacteria to proliferate and make us healthy. They help reduce metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is what happens when we've accumulated enough fat for that fat to behave like its own organ. And that fat then starts to tell your body to store more fat rather than to use that fat as a source of energy. So it just sets you up for making it metabolically more difficult to burn your own fat. So these guys actually turn that around. They actually reduce insulin resistance, which is part of metabolic syndrome. They may help to reduce our appetite because when you have short-chain fatty acids floating through your bloodstream, you don't have hormones that come out that tell you you're hungry because you have that access to that energy. So that's really cool too. We reduce inflammation, protect against colorectal cancers, we just talked about that. Increase gut motility, which just means how long it takes for things to get through your intestines. So when we have food that sort of takes a long time to pass through there and it's touching our cell walls, there's a lot more time for what we would consider toxins, things that need to be eliminated, to be touching those cells and causing for things like little tumors to come out, or just bad stuff that we don't want. So in general, you want that stuff to make its way out of there as quickly as possible, and short-chain fatty acids help with that. Also, to induce differentiation of T cells, which is just improving our immune response. Okay, a T cell is an immune cell that eats the bad guys. So, can probiotics improve gastrointestinal issues? So this was actually part of one of the interviews that I did with a guy who's actually what we call like a referee. So he is not only an expert on probiotics, but he reads all of the papers that come in through these journals, which means that these scientists have to spend so much time looking at poo and looking at how people how they're eating and their health outcomes. And he reads all of these papers that these scientists do, along with several other guys, and then they determine what studies were done well enough to be published in their journals. So this particular guy, not only does he do research, but he reads all of the research, and he's much, much smarter than I am. So I asked him, what are some of the possible improvements from taking probiotics that we can get? So there's, if you have taken antibiotics for some reason, those antibiotics don't just kill the bad bacteria that are making you sick, they'll also get rid of all the good bacteria in your intestines. So a lot of times when that happens, then you might go eat something like, let's say, some mac and cheese or something. There's no bacteria in there to sort of help you digest that. And our body likes to have something called homeostasis, and there's very little in your intestine. We've just put a whole bunch of sugars in there, and we don't have enough enzymes to break them all down. There's a whole lot of water in our blood. It's like something like 97-98% water, and there's not nearly as much in that mac and cheese. So what's going to happen is it's going to draw water across your gut lining and give you diarrhea. So if you go ahead and you take your probiotics, you're going to start populating that area, and we'll have a more balanced water situation. So you can reduce antibiotic-associated diarrhea. Okay, So then, after we talked about antibiotic-associated diarrhea, we're going to see what else it can help. And one of those things are like C. diff, which is Clostridium, which is a different kind of bacteria, it's a bad bacteria that gives you diarrhea, and rotavirus. So it can also help with those things. Number one, because it's going to start killing those off itself because it doesn't want to share your intestines with them. These are good bacteria. Two, because it's increased our own immune system. So hopefully we can get rid of these guys much easier, or they won't even get us sick to begin with. Something called pouchitis, which is like an infection or just like a sour stomach. Ulcerative colitis, IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, and respiratory infections. So a lot of studies have shown positive improvements in those things. There's some inconclusive data when we look at things like diverticulitis, traveler's diarrhea, which is basically when you go to like Montezuma's Revenge, if you've ever heard of that. Or a lot of times if you go to another country and you're not used to their bacteria, eating there can make you sick. Vaginal infections, cold and flus, obesity, and anxiety. A lot of studies do point to some of these things being helped, but the data's kind of not strong enough yet to give us conclusive evidence. So I'm going to go through one of the questions that I asked, and I actually gave this talk a few years ago, and I had a girl get up and leave because of the answer that he gave. Because I just said all of the good things that taking probiotics do for you. They're pretty safe. So should I take a probiotic? And this guy said, probably not. You can get enough probiotics from healthy foods, just from having a yogurt or kefir or whatever it is that you like, that you don't necessarily have to go take them for no reason. They can be kind of pricey. When you look at the brands that are out there, so I talked a lot about how diverse of an ecosystem we have down there. It's something like 35,000 different types of cells, of different bacteria that live there. If you go to the store and you look, most of the time, like Culturelle, I think is two, it's two different kinds of bacteria, like 2 lactobacilli. The most I think I've seen is like 12 different groups. In short, we just don't know enough about what's going on down there yet to really optimize it. And there's no evidence to say that taking it is going to make our lives any better. If you want to and you didn't have a doctor tell you that you shouldn't, it's not going to hurt you for the most part. It's pretty safe. We'll talk about some of the dangers that there are. But this guy's like, no, don't waste your money. Go ahead and have yogurt. We'll talk about how much is enough. But unless it's recommended by your physician, your gastroenterologist, or another healthcare professional, supplements are in general not recommended. So while they're pretty much recognized as very safe for healthy people, they can be costly, and there's just not enough research to say that they're really efficient at helping us. There are some that are. I do have a chart in here that's really hard to read. If you go to my blog, you may be able to see it a little bit better, but it does show you some of the better versions that are out there. The people who should not really take probiotics are if you're elderly and your doctor hasn't advised you to, you would want to ask before you go take them. If you're immunocompromised, so for instance, I have an immune disorder, so I would never take this stuff unless my doctor said, yes, you should take it, or advised me to take it. If you're critically ill, you shouldn't take these things. If you've had endocarditis, sepsis, fungemia, sometimes things like bacterial overgrowths. There's no evidence to show that you can get a bacterial overgrowth from taking probiotics, but if you've had one, you definitely don't want to go put extra bacteria down there, unless your doctor tells you to. So without taking a probiotic supplement, other things before I do have another lecture that where I'm about to do, we're going to talk about health supplements. But when you take a supplement, it is not regulated by the FDA, so there's nobody even checking to make sure what they say is in there. There's nobody checking to make sure that those cultures have stayed alive or that they haven't been contaminated. These things are not regulated, so a lot of times we can't say that they're 100% safe. So if you do take one, you want to make sure that you really trust that brand. So how can we include a probiotic into our diet naturally? You can do it through yogurt, through something called kefir, which is like a Middle Eastern yogurt drink. Tempeh, which is just fermented tofu, like fermented soybeans. Kimchi, which is like a sauerkraut that's been fermented. It's actually delicious. It's Korean, it's an Asian food. Aged cheese, like blue cheeses and cheddars, things where you can see the bacteria still in there. Kombucha, which kind of is just like a juice that sort of they let sit out and catch a little bacteria and before it turned into real alcohol. So it's kind of like on the cusp. So some people really like the way it tastes and some people don't. So check to see if your brand has the Live and Active Cultures logo. I think that might be starting to become outdated. But you want to read the label and make sure that there are live and active cultures in the container. So what are prebiotics? We talk about probiotics and sometimes we'll read articles about a prebiotic. Prebiotics are the substances that help to fuel probiotics. They are what probiotics eat, so they're what those bacteria want to eat. They are fermentable fibers, which means that they're fiber that those guys can get to before our own intestines can get to, and many times our own intestines do not make enough enzymes to really break these guys down. That's why if you take something that has a lot of oligosaccharides like beans, it can make you gassy. Because these guys eat those oligosaccharides and ferment them and make gas. And so then you have gas. So what you can do to prevent the gas is take some enzymes like Beano, and that'll help you break this stuff down. So that's just a little aside. So fermentable fibers or non-digestible carbohydrates, and we'll talk about that. Those stimulate the growth and activity of probiotics because it's like giving them a buffet. So the fermentation of these fibers by probiotics promotes the production of bacterial end products such as your folate, your short-chain fatty acids, all those things that help us. And they also help us with mineral absorption. So we talked about vitamins, but they also help us with mineral absorption. So things like zinc, which help with immune function. So I'm going to show you the next slide. We'll talk about where can probiotics be found. So fructans or resistant starches. What does that mean? That means things like inulin, chicory root, fructooligosaccharides. That means this is like beans. Chicory root fiber, you'll see if you ever go get that oikos with the black label. So usually it's like 000. They put chicory root and inulin right in there. So they're giving you a probiotic, they're giving you a lot of protein, and then they're giving you a prebiotic to help feed those guys. So that's maybe not my favorite tasting Greek yogurt, but it's really a lot of bang for its buck. And I would love to see anyone do any research about that, because I think that's a great idea where you don't have to take a supplement, but you're taking a food that's maybe been enhanced a little bit with things that bacteria like to eat. And a lot of the best supplements come with a prebiotic in them as well. Like Culturelle, I believe, is one that has a prebiotic in it as well. So a vegetable source of these things, these big words: onions, artichokes, fruits like unripe bananas, so the greener the better here, wheat, and garlic. Okay, so those are some things that you can eat so that you don't have to go take a $30 supplement. This slide, I knew you wouldn't be able to see it. It's actually a table from, no one can ever see it. I have the table at my website. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about what is on there. This is just something that shows all of the bacteria that were used in different studies. So all of the different types of probiotics. And one stood out. It's got about 8 kinds of bacteria in it. It's called #VSL3. And that's the only one that's actually been shown to help people with weight loss. So, and it's something that you probably would have to go to your pharmacy, you might have to ask your doctor to give you a prescription for, that way your health insurance will cover it, you don't have to worry about spending that 30 or 40 bucks, and you can get it through them. Anything that says lactobacillus in it, so will be good for you. So like Culturelle is one of the better ones, and then there's one that starts with an A that will come to me before the end of this. But this slide is really, it's just a table from a big paper where they talk about some of the supplements that have been shown to be effective in different ways. So again, Culturelle is probably one of the best ones that you can get on the market. It is a little bit pricey. It's got maybe one or two kinds of bacteria in there. Our guts have 35,000 kinds of bacteria in there. So it's not something I would say to take every day for the rest of your life, but if you're having some tummy troubles, it might not be a bad idea. There's another brand called #VSL3. That one has been shown to help people lose weight. And we don't really know by what mechanism, but probably some combination of all the stuff that we just talked about. So from there, I'm just going to give you some of the resources. So that table that I just showed you that we couldn't see is going to be in one of these papers. So it's going to be in this last one here. So if you wanted to, you could just go right to my website and you can look this stuff up and you can take a look at that slide yourself. I have the slide enlarged there as well. If you love reading papers about probiotics, then these are all some of the papers that I referenced in this study, or in this talk today. So that is probiotics, and I will let you go.